A millionaire was heartbroken when he lost his wife and children in a traffic accident. One day, when he visited his wife's grave, he suddenly heard a cry. But it was hard to believe that the cry came from... The sky sagged beneath a canopy of slate-grey clouds, weeping relentlessly over the cemetery sprawled below. Rain pelted the taut surfaces of black umbrellas, a staccato rhythm that mingled with the rustle of wet leaves on ancient oaks. Mourners huddled close, their boots squelching in the sodden earth, their breath fogging in the chill. The air hummed with the scent of damp grass and the faint bitter sting of sorrow, sharp as the drizzle cutting through the afternoon. Matthew stood at the grave's edge, his shoulders bowed under a drenched suit that clung to him like a shroud. In his hand, a single white lily, Elizabeth's flower, quivered, its petals heavy with rain. His gaze locked on the coffin, its dark mahogany slick and gleaming, a cruel barrier to the wife and child stolen from him 2 days ago in a car crash. 8 months pregnant, radiant, gone. His mind replayed her smile in a loop he couldn't escape. Nearby, the priest adjusted his sodden robes, his voice rising above the storm's murmur. "We commend Elizabeth to your care, Lord, and her child, taken too soon," he intoned, hands clasped. "May they find peace in your embrace." The words drifted past Matthew, hollow and distant, as his fingers tightened around the lily, bending its stem. A woman in a black coat muttered to her companion, "Such a shame, so young," her voice nearly lost to the wind. The man beside her nodded, shifting his umbrella. "And the baby too. God, it's awful." Alex, Matthew's younger brother, lingered at his side, a steady hand resting on his shoulder. His face was pale beneath the dripping brim of his umbrella, but his posture held firm. "I'll take care of the company, Matt," he said quietly, leaning closer to be heard over the rain. "You don't need to think about that now, okay?" Matthew gave a faint nod, his eyes still fixed on the coffin, the thud of dirt hitting wood drowning out everything else. A grey-haired man in a tweed coat approached, his voice gruff but kind. "She was a good woman, Matthew. Always had a smile for everyone." He clapped Matthew's arm awkwardly, waiting for a response. Matthew managed a hoarse, "Yeah, she was," his throat tight, barely glancing up. The man hesitated, then shuffled back to the thinning crowd, murmuring, "Take care, son," as he went. The priest stepped closer, rain streaking his glasses. "If you need to talk, Matthew, the church is always open," he offered, his tone gentle but firm. "God has a plan, even in this." Matthew's jaw clenched, and he rasped, "Doesn't feel like it," his voice cracking at the edges. The priest nodded, unfazed, and retreated, leaving Matthew alone as the last mourners drifted away, their condolences fading into the storm. He stood there, the rain pooling around his shoes, until the groundskeeper's shovels slowed. Opening his hand, he let the lily fall, watching it tumble into the mud, a fleeting white speck swallowed by the dark earth. His chest shuddered with a silent breath as he turned, trudging toward the parking lot. Headstones loomed like silent watchers, and the iron gates groaned faintly in the distance, marking his exit from her resting place. The drive home passed in a haze, the city's lights smearing into streaks of gold and red beyond the glass. When he pulled into the driveway, the mansion loomed ahead, its stone facade cold and unyielding under the storm. Matthew stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind him, with a sound that echoed through the cavernous foyer. His soaked shoes left faint prints on the marble, a trail that faded as he crossed into the living room. The space stretched vast and empty, leather furniture gleaming dully, a fireplace cold and unlit, the air heavy with silence. He sank onto the couch, the damp fabric of his suit seeping into the cushions, and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. His hands hung limp, still trembling from the cold, though he barely felt it. The quiet pressed in, thick and suffocating, wrapping around him like a shroud. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked faintly, each second stretching into eternity, marking the first night of a life he didn't know how to live. Dawn bled faintly over the horizon, a thin thread of light piercing the dense fog that cloaked the cemetery in a ghostly veil. The air trembled with stillness, heavy with the scent of wet earth and the sharp bite of frost, as if the world itself paused to mourn. Ancient headstones jutted from the ground, their edges softened by time and dew, while the gnarled branches of a solitary oak stretched overhead, dripping silently onto the grass below. Matthew stepped from his car, the gravel crunching beneath his boots, a bouquet of white lilies dangling loosely in his grip. 14 days had dragged by since Elizabeth's funeral, 14 nights of staring at the ceiling, her absence a weight that crushed his ribs. And yet something had pulled him here, unbidden, to her grave. He moved through the mist, his breath clouding in brief, fleeting bursts, and knelt beside the headstone, fingers brushing the carved letters of her name. The cold marble bit into his skin as he swept away a dusting of dirt, his chest tightening with each stroke. Then, having something. A faint sound, a rustle, sharp and sudden, jerked his head up, his pulse spiking. His eyes darted through the haze, narrowing on a shadowed shape near the oak. A weathered wicker basket, half shrouded, its edges frayed and glistening with damp. He froze, breath held, until a second sound sliced through the quiet. A weak, trembling cry, small but piercing, like a shard of glass in the stillness. His heart lurched, a wild thud against his ribs, and he stumbled to his feet, the lilies slipping in his sweaty palm as he staggered closer. The cry grew clearer, a fragile wail that clawed at his nerves, and he reached the basket, hands shaking as he dropped to his knees. Inside, a newborn writhed beneath a thin blanket, its tiny chest heaving, fists curling in desperate little spasms. Matthew's breath snagged, a ragged gasp that burned his throat, and his vision tunneled. Soft brown hair, damp and matted, a delicate jawline that mirrored Elizabeth's in a way that stopped his world. His fingers hovered above the child, trembling violently, afraid to touch, afraid it might dissolve into the mist. A folded note slipped from the blanket, tumbling into the wet grass, and he snatched it up, fumbling to unfold it with hands that felt clumsy, foreign. The ink was jagged, scrawled in haste. Elizabeth died. But this is your child, swapped with a dead infant to trick you. The words slammed into him, each one a punch to his gut, and he read them again, lips moving silently, as if they might shift into something less impossible. His eyes flicked back to the baby, those features, that hair, and a choked sound escaped him, half sob, half disbelief. "What the hell is this?" he rasped, voice cracking, his fingers digging into the note until it crumpled. The baby whimpered again, and his hands shot out, yanking the basket closer, his jacket brushing the rough weave as he hunched over it. His chest heaved, breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts, and he rocked back on his heels, lilies spilling around him like scattered stars. Disbelief roared in his skull, louder than the rain that day, louder than the priest's prayers. But beneath it, a fierce, molten instinct surged, wrapping around his heart like a fist. He pressed a trembling hand to his mouth, staring at the child, his other hand clutching the basket's edge as if letting go might unravel him entirely. A distant voice broke through, gruff, concerned. "Hey, you okay over there?" A groundskeeper loomed in the fog, a vague shape near the gates. Matthew flinched, his grip tightening. "Yeah, I'm fine," he barked, voice hoarse, waving the man off. The figure lingered, then faded, leaving him alone with the impossible. He sank lower, the cold seeping through his jeans, his gaze locked on the baby until his eyes stung, blurred with something he couldn't name. Rising on unsteady legs, he hoisted the basket and carried it to his car, the mist swirling around him like a reluctant shroud. He secured it in the passenger seat, hands still quaking, the note jammed into his pocket, its edges biting his thigh. The engine growled awake, shattering the silence, and he drove off, knuckles white on the wheel, the cemetery shrinking in the mirror as a storm of hope and dread churned within him. The city stirred awake beyond the windshield, a muted symphony of horns and distant engines threading through the early morning haze. Streetlights cast fleeting golden pools across the asphalt, their glow fracturing in the fine mist that clung to the glass, while the hum of the heater filled the car with a soft, insistent warmth. Outside, the world moved on, delivery trucks rumbling past, a jogger's silhouette darting through the dawn, oblivious to the fracture in Matthew's reality. He drove in silence, one hand clamped tight on the steering wheel, the other resting lightly on the edge of the wicker basket strapped into the passenger seat. The baby, small, fragile, impossibly real, shifted faintly beneath the thin blanket, its breaths a quiet rhythm against the chaos in his mind. His eyes flicked to it, then back to the road, the note in his pocket a jagged weight pressing against his thigh. "Is this someone's sick joke?" he muttered, his voice low and ragged, barely audible over the engine's growl. His knuckles whitened, jaw clenching, as he pictured Elizabeth's face, her hazel eyes, her laugh. But the thought twisted, landing on the scrawled words, swapped with a dead infant. Yet here was this child, alive, defenseless, and he couldn't look away without feeling a pull, sharp and deep, urging him to shield it. The mansion loomed as he pulled into the driveway, its stone walls stark against the paling sky. Inside, the silence swallowed him again, thicker now, with the basket cradled in his arms as he crossed the marble foyer. He fumbled through the quiet rooms, setting the baby on the kitchen counter, his hands clumsy as he rummaged for a saucepan to warm milk. The hiss of the stove filled the space, and he stood there, stirring formula with a spoon that clinked against the metal, watching bubbles rise. "Lucas," he whispered, testing the name he and Elizabeth had chosen months ago, his voice catching as it echoed faintly off the tiles. The baby stirred, and he lifted it, him, cradling Lucas against his chest, the warmth of the tiny body seeping through his shirt. Days blurred into a haze of tentative care. Nights spent pacing with Lucas in his arms, days hunched over the basket in the bedroom, the mansion's vastness shrinking to these small, fragile moments. Alex arrived one afternoon, his knock sharp against the door, a cardboard coffee tray and a stack of company reports tucked under his arm. "Thought you could use this," he said, setting the cups on the dining table, his tone easy as he spread papers across the polished wood. "Board's antsy, but I've got it handled. Sales projections, new client pitches." His calm voice flowed through the room, a lifeline Matthew grasped without fully listening, his eyes drifting to Lucas, asleep in the room nearby. Matthew has not told his brother about the baby yet, at least not until he knows for sure about the baby's origins. "You holding up all right?" Alex asked, leaning back in his chair, sipping his coffee while his gaze swept the room. Matthew shrugged, forcing a tight, "Yeah, getting by," his fingers brushing the blanket's edge as he avoided meeting his brother's eyes. A memory flickered through the fog. Elizabeth laughing as they painted the nursery, her hands flecked with pale blue, her voice teasing him about his crooked lines. His chest tightened, a dull ache blooming, and he turned away, focusing on Lucas's steady breathing, the rise and fall a quiet anchor. Night fell, and after Alex left, his car fading into the dusk with a crunch of gravel, Matthew sat alone in the dim living room, the basket beside him on the couch. He pulled the note from his pocket, unfolding it under the faint glow of a lamp, its creases worn from restless handling. His fingers traced the jagged ink, the words blurring as he squinted at them, torn between chucking it into the fireplace and chasing the madness they promised. "Who did this?" he murmured, his voice a rough whisper, the question hanging unanswered in the stillness. He glanced at Lucas, the baby's soft features tugging at something raw inside him, a fragile thread of purpose threading through his exhaustion. The clock ticked faintly from the hall, each second stretching long and heavy, marking the days since he'd found Lucas. days that felt both endless and fleeting. Matthew rose, pacing to the window, and watched Alex's taillights vanish around the bend. A faint unease stirred beneath his fatigue, a shadow he couldn't name, rippling through the quiet as he stood there, the weight of the note and the child pulling him into an uncertain dawn. Beyond the mansion's tall windows, the afternoon unfurled in a wash of muted gold, the sun dipping low to graze the rooftops of the city sprawled below. A delivery van rumbled down the street, its engine a faint growl against the rustle of leaves skittering across the driveway, while a pair of pigeons fluttered from the gutter, their wings slicing through the stillness. Inside, the air carried the faint tang of warmed milk and the lingering scent of polished wood, a quiet world holding its breath. Matthew paced the living room, his footsteps a soft thud against the thick rug, his shadow stretching long and restless across the walls. Lucas dozed in the wicker basket on the coffee table, a small bundle of blanket and soft breaths, his presence a tether Matthew couldn't shake. The note, its jagged ink and impossible claim, gnawed at him relentlessly, a splinter lodged deep in his thoughts. He'd kept it hidden, folded tight in his pocket, its words replaying in the sleepless hours. Your child, swapped with a dead infant. Impossible, yet undeniable, and the uncertainty clawed at him until he snatched his phone from the armrest, dialing a number he hadn't called since Elizabeth's last checkup. "Hey, Dr. Patel," he said, his voice low and urgent, roughened by fatigue. "I need a favor, an ADN test off the books. Can you meet me today?" The clinic waited across town, a squat brick building tucked behind a row of leafless trees, its fluorescent lights humming a cold, steady pulse when Matthew arrived. He carried Lucas inside, the basket cradled against his chest, his coat brushing the doorframe as he stepped into the sterile lobby. A nurse in pale scrubs greeted him with a clipped, "This way, Mr. Dawson," leading him to a small room where the air buzzed with antiseptic and the faint hum of machinery. Matthew set the basket on an exam table, his hands clenching the edge of a chair as the nurse approached with a swab. She brushed it against Lucas's cheek, the baby's face scrunching in a faint whimper, and Matthew reached out instinctively, stroking a tiny fist until the sound faded. "Easy, bud," he murmured, startled by how natural it felt, his own cheek swabbed next with a quick, practiced motion. Time crawled in that room, the clock's tick a slow drumbeat against his nerves, and Matthew sat rigid, his fingers drumming the armrest, eyes locked on Lucas. The nurse returned with Dr. Patel, a wiry man with a composed face and steady hands, who carried a thin file. "Results are in," Patel said, his tone even, almost too calm. "The child is yours, Matthew. Biologically, no question." Matthew's knees buckled, a sudden weakness flooding his legs, and he gripped the chair harder, staring at Lucas as the words sank in. His son, his and Elizabeth's, alive, breathing, here. Joy surged, a bright, jagged wave that crashed against a tide of bewilderment, leaving him breathless. "How?" he rasped, voice breaking as he looked up at Patel. "She died. How's this possible?" The doctor shook his head, a faint crease in his brow. "That's not my field, but he's yours. We make sure about that." A memory flickered, unbidden. Elizabeth curled against him on their couch, her head resting on his chest, her voice soft as she promised their baby a future full of love. His throat tightened, a lump he couldn't swallow, and he reached out, brushing Lucas's fine hair with a trembling hand, the strands soft as whispers against his skin. The room tilted, the fluorescent hum fading to a distant drone, and he saw her in the baby's face, her gentle curve of jaw, her quiet strength, alive in a way he hadn't dared hope. He left the clinic in a daze, Lucas secured in a new car seat, a hasty purchase from a shop down the street, its straps snug around the tiny frame. The drive home passed in silence, the city's blur of lights and traffic, a distant hum against the storm in his mind. "You're mine," he said, glancing at Lucas, his voice a rough whisper, barely audible over the engine. His hands tightened on the wheel, resolve hardening like steel in his bones. He needed answers, needed to unravel the lie that had buried Elizabeth and left Lucas in its shadow. The mansion rose ahead, its silhouette stark against the twilight, and Matthew pulled into the driveway, the weight of truth and mystery settling deep, pulling him toward a reckoning he couldn't yet see. Night unfurled over the city like a heavy curtain, its edges softened by a thin shroud of clouds that dulled the stars to faint pinpricks. Beyond the mansion's wrought-iron gates, the street lay quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves tumbling across the pavement, chased by a fitful wind that whispered through the bare branches of the oaks lining the drive. A lone street lamp flickered, casting a wavering pool of amber light onto the lawn, where a stray cat darted past, its eyes glinting briefly before it vanished into the shadows. Inside, the grand house stood as a sentinel of silence, its high ceilings and polished surfaces steeped in the faint musk of cedar and the gentle glow of a single lamp, its warmth a fragile shield against the encroaching dark. Matthew padded through the kitchen, the cool tiles seeping through his socks, his movements deliberate as he adjusted the flame beneath a small pot on the stove. A bottle warmed there, steam curling upward in lazy tendrils, and he stirred the formula with a spoon, the soft clink of metal against metal, a quiet rhythm in the stillness. The nursery door hung ajar, a sliver of light spilling across the hall from the crib where Lucas slept. A proper crib now, its wooden slats gleaming faintly after a hurried delivery earlier that week. Matthew crossed to it, peering down at the baby nestled in a blanket he'd smoothed countless times, its edges worn from his restless hands. "Your mum would have spoiled you rotten," he murmured, his voice a tender thread weaving through the hush, his mind drifting to Elizabeth's laugh, her eyes bright with plans for their child. "I'll figure this out, Lucas. I'll keep you safe, no matter what." The promise settled deep, fueled by the ADN test's truth, a tether binding him to this small life amidst the wreckage of his own. A sharp, insistent ring shattered the quiet, the doorbell cutting through the night like a blade. Matthew stiffened, his hand pausing mid-air, and glanced at the clock. 11:47 p.m. His brow creased, a flicker of unease tightening his jaw as he crossed the foyer, the marble cold against his feet. He pressed his eye to the peephole, breath catching at the sight. A woman stood on the porch, drenched from head to toe, her dark hair plastered to a face pale as moonlight, her thin coat trembling with her shuddering frame. He swung the door open, cold air rushing in, and she lurched forward, her voice breaking as she gasped. "Please, you have to help me, I can't stay out there." Matthew's grip tightened on the knob, his voice sharp with confusion. "Who the hell are you?" She stumbled past him, water dripping onto the floor in dark splotches, and sagged against the wall, her arms wrapped tight around herself. "I'm Barbara," she said, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush, her breath hitching. I worked at the hospital. Your brother, Alex, he paid me to do it. He sabotaged Elizabeth's car, made it crash, wanted her and the baby dead." Matthew's face drained, blood retreating from his cheeks as his lungs seized, but she pressed on, her voice quaking yet relentless. "It wasn't enough. He planned to take Lucas, raise him, use him to get your money, your company, everything. I was the nurse. I swapped the babies, gave him a dead one to bury instead. But I couldn't live with it. I left Lucas at her grave for you." She choked on a sob, her hands shaking as she met his widening eyes. "He's insane. He's after me now. He knows I ran." Matthew reeled, his shoulder slamming into the doorframe as his legs wavered, a photo on the console catching his gaze. Him and Alex at a company gala, arms slung around each other, grins wide and carefree. The memory curdled, twisting into something rancid, and he pressed a hand to his mouth, bile burning his throat as her words carved through him. "Alex?" he croaked, the name a broken shard on his tongue, disbelief tangling with a cold, creeping horror. Upstairs, Lucas stirred, a faint whimper drifting down the stairs, and Matthew's head snapped up, the sound grounding him as the room tilted. "You're full of it. How I can believed in you. He is my brother," he snapped, voice rising, but Barbara shook her head, her desperation stark. "I'm not, I swear. Lock the doors, please. He'll kill me if he finds me." Her terror, raw, unfeigned, sliced through his skepticism, and he moved on autopilot, slamming the deadbolt home with a heavy thud, his hands fumbling as he checked the windows, curtains rustling under his grip. "Stay there," he muttered, jabbing a finger toward the couch, his eyes narrowing with lingering doubt, even as he offered refuge. She nodded, collapsing onto the cushions, water pooling beneath her trembling form, and Matthew climbed the stairs, each step a leaden weight, his breath shallow and uneven. In the nursery, he stood over Lucas's crib, the baby's calm face bathed in the soft glow of a nightlight, his tiny chest rising and falling in oblivious peace. Matthew's hands clamped onto the railing, knuckles whitening until they ached as rage swelled within him, hot, jagged, a storm breaking against the quiet. Alex, his brother, his rock, had orchestrated this nightmare, and the betrayal seared, a wound deeper than loss itself. He stared at Lucas, the last fragment of Elizabeth, and whispered, "I'll make this right," his voice thick with fury and resolve, the words a vow as the night closed in, heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. Morning spilled across the city in a tentative glow, sunlight filtering through the gauzy haze of clouds that lingered after the night's unrest. Beyond the mansion's tall windows, the lawn glistened with dew, a faint shimmer catching the first rays, while a delivery truck grumbled down the street, its exhaust curling into the crisp air. A pair of sparrows flitted between the shrubs, their chirps a fragile melody against the hum of waking life, and the world stretched awake, oblivious to the tension coiled within the stone walls. Matthew stood at the kitchen counter, the scent of warmed milk mingling with the faint bitterness of coffee he'd brewed to steady his nerves. Lucas nestled in his arms, a bottle tilted carefully to the baby's lips, and Matthew watched the slow rhythm of tiny swallows, his thumb brushing the soft curve of a cheek. Barbara's words from the night before looped in his skull, relentless, corrosive, casting every memory of Alex in a shadowed light. He'd let her stay, reluctantly, her trembling form still slumped on the couch when he'd checked at dawn, her pleas for safety, a chain he couldn't yet break. Answers. He needed answers, and until then, she was a risk he'd tethered to his side. A sharp rap at the door jolted him, his grip tightening on Lucas, as Barbara's head snapped up from the living room, her eyes wide with panic. "It's him," she whispered, her voice a ragged thread, her hands clutching the blanket he'd tossed her hours ago. Matthew's pulse surged, a cold sweat prickling his neck, and he thrust the bottle into her shaking grasp. "Take him upstairs, now," he hissed, his tone low and urgent, pointing toward the nursery. "Keep him quiet no matter what." She nodded, scrambling to her feet, and cradled Lucas against her chest, her footsteps quick and uneven as she disappeared up the stairs. Matthew smoothed his shirt, forcing a deep breath as he crossed to the foyer, his hand hesitating on the knob before swinging the door open. Alex stood there when he opened the door, a cardboard coffee tray balanced in one hand, his dark coat slung casually over his arm. "Morning, Matt," Alex said, his tone light, almost too easy, as he stepped inside, setting the cups on the dining table. "Figured you could use a jolt. Rough night, huh?" His eyes swept the room, a quick, casual scan that paused briefly at the stairs, and Matthew forced a smile, thin but steady, nodding as he took a cup. "Yeah, didn't sleep much," Matthew replied, his voice even despite the pulse hammering beneath his calm facade, and he leaned against the table, sipping the coffee as Alex launched into business talk. "Board's pushing for updates," Alex said, spreading a few papers across the wood, his fingers tapping a rhythm on the edge. "I've got the numbers sorted. New contracts coming in, steady growth. You don't need to worry, Matt. I've got it covered." The words flowed smooth, a lifeline Matthew had once clung to, but now they grated, each one laced with a question he couldn't voice. Not yet. A faint cry drifted from upstairs, soft and fleeting, and Matthew's heart lurched, his grip tightening on the cup. Barbara must have hushed Lucas just in time, the sound cutting off as quickly as it came, but Alex's head tilted, his brow creasing slightly. "What was that?" he asked, his gaze lingering on the stairs, a hint of curiosity flickering in his eyes. Matthew shrugged, forcing his voice to stay level. "Old toy. Elizabeth got it for the nursery. Some talking bear thing. Keeps shorting out, making weird noises." He took another sip, the lie smooth on his tongue, and Alex nodded slowly, his expression easing, though his eyes stayed sharp, probing for a beat too long. They talked a while longer, numbers, clients, nothing that mattered, and parted with a handshake, Alex's fingers firm, lingering a fraction beyond normal. "Take care, all right?" Alex said, clapping Matthew's shoulder before heading out, his boots clicking on the porch. Matthew watched him go, tension coiling in his shoulders as the car pulled away, its engine fading into the morning hum. He shut the door, the lock clicking with a sound that echoed too loud, and crossed to a drawer in the living room, pulling out an old letter, Alex's looping script congratulating him on a deal years back, words of pride and camaraderie that had once meant everything. He held it under the lamp, the paper crisp between his fingers, and read the lines again, each one hollow now, a mocking echo of the brother he'd trusted. His hand shook, crumpling the sheet into a tight ball, the crackle of it loud in the silence, and he tossed it onto the table where it rolled to a stop beside Lucas's empty bottle. Matthew stood there, the sunlight cutting harsh across his face, the weight of doubt and deception settling deep, a quiet fury simmering beneath the mask he'd worn too well. Dusk settled over the city in a slow bleed of amber and violet, the skyline jagged against a sky bruised by fading light. Beyond the glass walls of Matthew's office tower, the streets below pulsed with life. Cars weaving through the evening rush, their headlights carving paths through the gathering gloom, while a vendor's cart rattled along the sidewalk, its bell a faint chime swallowed by the hum of the urban sprawl. The air inside carried the sterile bite of air conditioning and the muted scent of leather, a stark contrast to the restless churn beyond. "Leave a comment. Nut milk, if you're not a skimmer." Matthew sat behind his desk, the sleek expanse of polished oak, a barrier between him and the chaos of his thoughts, his fingers tapping an uneven rhythm on the edge. Barbara's fearful eyes from that morning haunted him, wide, darting, etched with a terror that gnawed at his skepticism, tipping the scales toward belief. Alex's easy grin, once a comfort, now loomed in his mind like a mask, and the memory of her trembling voice, "He'll kill me if he finds me," tightened his chest with a cold, creeping certainty. He couldn't wait any longer. He needed proof, something solid to anchor the storm brewing inside him. He dialed a number from a faded business card, his voice low when the line clicked. "David, it's Matthew Dawson. Can you come by tonight? I've got something for you." David arrived an hour later, a weathered figure in a rumpled coat, his graying beard framing a face carved with years of hard-earned lines. He dropped into the chair across from Matthew, his gruff, "What's the job?" cutting through the silence as he leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Matthew slid a folder across the desk, Barbara's account scribbled in hasty notes, the crumpled cemetery letter tucked inside, keeping Lucas's existence a guarded secret, his name unspoken. "My brother Alex," he said, his tone flat but edged with strain. "I need you to follow him, find out who he's meeting, what he's doing. This says he might have hurt someone I loved." David's eyes narrowed, scanning the pages, and he gave a curt nod, stirred by the quiet intensity in Matthew's stare. "I'll dig," he grunted, pocketing the folder as he rose. "Give me some days." Matthew's quiet intensity, eyes burning, jaw set, stirred the man, and he pocketed the folder with a nod, disappearing into the dusk. The next nights stretched long and heavy, the mansion's silence broken only by the soft creak of floorboards as Matthew paced the living room, Lucas asleep in the crib nearby. David returned after midnight, his boots leaving faint dirt on the rug as he tossed a stack of photos onto the coffee table. Grainy shots of Alex in shadowed corners, shaking hands with a rival CEO in a dim alley, exchanging glances with a known fixer outside a seedy bar. Matthew sank onto the couch, his hands steady as he spread the images out, each one a shard piercing the trust he'd clung to. This doesn't prove it. I can't deny or find a reason for him. Why? He is my brother, my blood. He muttered, his voice rough, but the certainty grew, a dark bloom fueled by the faces staring back at him. Men he'd outmaneuvered, men who'd relish his fall. A memory stabbed through the haze. Years back, Alex slouched over a beer in a dive bar, his tone bitter as he sneered. "Everything just falls into your lap, huh?" Matthew had laughed it off, clapping his shoulder, but now it festered, a wound reopened. Another flashed. Childhood summers, him teaching Alex multiplication tables under a porch light, the two of them kicking a soccer ball in the yard, dirt-streaked and grinning. The contrast clawed at him. Innocence warped into something sinister, and he pressed his palms to his eyes, willing the images to align. Brother, betrayer. Upstairs, Barbara's voice drifted down, restless and sharp. "We can't just sit here. He's dangerous," she called, her footsteps pacing the hall, her shadow flickering on the stairs. Matthew climbed halfway up, his hand gripping the banister as he shot back. "I need more. Something hard, not just pictures." "Stay put." His tone hushed her, firm but fraying, and he returned to the photos, spreading them wider, searching for the thread that would unravel it all. The clock ticked past 2, its rhythm a dull pulse in the quiet, and Matthew stood, crossing to a shelf where a framed photo of Alex sat, younger, carefree, mid-laugh. He lifted it, his thumb pressing into the glass, harder and harder, until a crack spiderwebbed across the surface, the sound a brittle snap in the stillness. His breath shuddered, the hunter's eyes within him sharpening, tracking a truth he could no longer deny, as the city slept beyond the walls, unaware of the chase beginning within. Twilight slipped over the city like a whispered secret, its edges softening into a bruised tapestry of indigo and rust that bled across the horizon. Beyond the mansion's arched windows, the street lay in quiet repose, cobblestones catching the faint shimmer of a lone lamppost's glow, while a restless wind wove through the skeletal trees, scattering leaves in a chaotic waltz across the damp lawn. The air outside carried the crisp, earthy tang of autumn, mingling with the distant groan of a train snaking through the city's underbelly, a world turning its back on the turmoil brewing within these stone walls. Matthew stood in the nursery, the room awash in the tender glow of a crescent moon nightlight, its soft hum a fragile counterpoint to the creak of the rocking chair beneath him. Lucas nestled against his chest, a warm, living weight wrapped in a fleece blanket, his tiny breaths a steady cadence that Matthew clung to, one hand cradling the baby's head as he swayed. Barbara paced near the doorway, her footsteps a staccato rhythm on the hardwood, her silhouette flickering as she twisted her hands, her voice cutting through the stillness. "You've got the photos, Matthew. Those men he met, they're not innocent," she said, her tone taut, trembling with an edge that hadn't dulled since her confession. "He's a murderer, a manipulator. How long are you going to sit on this? He could come for us any second." Matthew's jaw clenched, her words, murderer, manipulator, ricocheting in his skull, each one a splinter driving deeper into the raw wound of his doubt. "I don't know yet," he muttered, his voice low, strained, his eyes fixed on Lucas. "I want to face him. God, I want to. But what if I'm wrong? What if there's more?" His mind churned, torn between the urge to storm Alex's door and the paralyzing weight of Lucas's every breath, a fragile life that tethered him to caution. "You're not wrong. You can't be. Barbara pressed, stepping closer, her shadow falling across the crib. He planned it all. Elizabeth, the baby, everything. You've got to do something. Matthew's chest tightened, a knot of rage and fear twisting inside him, and he whispered, "I will, when I'm sure." His tone sharper now, a plea to silence her as much as himself. The phone buzzed on the side table, a low, insistent hum that jolted him upright, and he eased Lucas into the crib, his fingers lingering on the blanket's edge as he snatched the device with a trembling hand. David's voice rasped through the line, gruff and heavy, each word deliberate. "Found your proof, Dawson," he said, pausing as if measuring the blow. "Mechanic on 5th Street, greasy little guy, says Alex slipped him $3,000 to cut the brakes on Elizabeth's car, 3 days before she crashed. Swears it's true, signed a statement with my pen." Matthew's hand clamped around the phone, the plastic groaning under his grip, and the room tilted, a slow, nauseating spin that blurred the nursery's edges. "You're sure?" he croaked, his throat dry as ash, his pulse hammering in his ears. "Sure as hell," David replied, his grunt firm, unyielding. He knew the car, knew her schedule. It's him, Matthew. The line went dead, and the silence roared back, deafening, as Matthew stumbled downstairs, his legs wobbling like they might betray him, his free hand clutching the banister until his knuckles blanched. Barbara trailed behind, her breath hitching as she hovered in the living room doorway, her eyes wide and shadowed, watching him pace the rug with steps that thudded like hammer strikes. "What did he say?" she asked, her voice small but urgent, and Matthew stopped, his head snapping toward her. "Alex paid to kill her. Cut the brakes," he said, the words spilling out raw, guttural, each one a blade slicing through him. Deliberate, cold-blooded. His hands flexed, testing their strength as the mechanic's confession replayed. $3,000, 3 days, and the air thickened with the scent of cedar and the faint, lingering sweetness of Lucas's formula, a cruel juxtaposition to the bile rising in his throat. A memory flared. Elizabeth that morning, leaning out the car window, her hair a golden halo in the sunlight as she waved, her voice bright with promise. "See you tonight. Don't work too late," she'd teased, and he'd grinned back, oblivious to the countdown already ticking. His fist clenched, nails digging crescent moons into his palm, and the loss sharpened, a jagged edge honed by Alex's intent, twisting grief into a snarling, feral rage. "He took her from me, even our unborn child, while I considered him the most beloved person after my parents passed away," he growled, half to Barbara, half to the empty room, his eyes burning as he met her gaze, her silent fear mirroring the fire in his chest. He took everything. He was more than a devil. The clock on the mantel struck 8, its chime a steady pulse against his unraveling calm, and Matthew climbed back upstairs, his steps heavy, deliberate, each one a brick laid in a wall of resolve. In the nursery, Lucas slept, his small face serene under the nightlight's glow, oblivious to the tempest inches away. Matthew leaned over the crib, his hands gripping the railing, until the wood creaked and whispered, "I'll get him, Lucas. I'll make him pay for what he did to her. To us." His voice shook, thick with a fury that hardened into iron, and his eyes glinted, sharp and unyielding, the promise searing into his soul. The room stilled, the weight of justice settling like a cloak around him as the evening deepened outside, its shadows stretching long and dark, mirroring the determination now etched into every line of his being. Daylight broke over the city in a hesitant wash of pale grey, the sky heavy with clouds that hung low, pressing down on the rooftops like a lid on a simmering pot. Beyond the police station's concrete walls, the streets buzzed with morning clamour, cars honking in staccato bursts, a street sweeper's bristles scraping the asphalt, while a flock of pigeons scattered from a nearby ledge, their wings a fleeting flurry against the muted light. Inside, the air thrummed with the sharp tang of stale coffee and the low hum of fluorescent bulbs, a sterile echo of the chaos about to unfold. Matthew stood outside Alex's apartment building, a sleek high-rise across town, his arms wrapped around Lucas, the baby bundled in a blanket against the chill. He delivered David's evidence at dawn, a thick file of the mechanic's testimony, grainy photos, bank trails tracing dirty cash, to the precinct, his voice steady as he'd handed it over. "It's all there," he'd told the detective, a broad-shouldered man with tired eyes, his tone flat but resolute. "He killed my wife. Make it stick." Now from a distance, he watched as officers stormed the glass-fronted lobby, their shouts muffled by the wind as they dragged Alex out, his wrists cuffed, his voice rising in defiant snarls. "This is bullshit! You've got nothing!" Alex yelled, twisting against the grip of a uniformed cop, his face flushed with rage. Matthew's grip tightened on Lucas, his jaw set, the sight a bitter salve to the wound that still bled. Inside the station later, Matthew faced Alex across a scratched metal table in a stark interrogation room, the walls a dull grey that swallowed the light. Alex slouched in his chair, cuffs clinking as he leaned forward, his sneer unrepentant, his eyes glinting with a venom Matthew hadn't seen before. "You think you've won?" Alex spat, his voice low and venomous, a smirk curling his lips. "I hated you, every damn day, watching you get everything while I scraped by in your shadow. Her dying? That was just the start. I'd have taken it all, Matt, every cent." Matthew's hands trembled on the table, fury surging hot and wild, and he leaned in, his voice shaking as he shot back. "You killed her. You killed our kid's future, and for what?" "Jealousy." His breath hitched, the words raw, but then his tone flattened, cold and final. "You're dead to me. Done." He stood, the chair scraping loud against the floor, and turned away, severing the last thread of their bond with a silence heavier than words. Barbara sat in a neighboring room, her voice steady through the glass as she testified, her hands shaking despite the firmness of her words. "He paid me to swap the babies, threatened me if I didn't," she said, her gaze fixed on the recorder, her fingers twisting the hem of her sleeve. "I saw him hand the cash to the mechanic myself, $3,000 3 days before." The detective nodded, scribbling notes, and Matthew caught her eye through the window, a brief, curt nod of acknowledgement passing between them, gratitude laced with the residue of mistrust. "She's telling the truth," he murmured to the officer beside him, his voice low, and stepped back, the weight of her words sealing Alex's fate. Back at the mansion, evening crept in, the sky a deepening slate beyond the windows as Matthew knelt by the fireplace, a stack of Alex's old letters in his hands, birthday cards, scribbled notes from college, fragments of a shared history now turned to ash. He fed them to the flames one by one, the paper curling and blackening, the fire's crackle a quiet requiem as it devoured the past. "You were my brother," he whispered, the words lost to the heat, his fingers lingering on the last envelope before tossing it in, watching the flames lick it away. The room glowed with flickering light, the scent of burning paper sharp in his nose, a cleansing that left only embers behind. Upstairs, he sank into a chair by Lucas's crib. The nursery hushed, save for the baby's soft breaths, the nightlight casting gentle shadows across the walls. Matthew rested a hand on the railing, his eyes tracing Lucas's peaceful face, justice settling over him like ash, grey, heavy, final. "It's over, kid," he said, his voice soft, steady now, the fury drained to a quiet resolve. Elizabeth's absence lingered, a hollow ache beneath it all, but he sat there, the weight of retribution grounding him, as the night stretched on, its silence a fragile peace over the wreckage left behind. Weeks had softened the city's edges, the sharp bite of autumn giving way to a gentler chill that whispered through the streets. Beyond the mansion's tall windows, the lawn lay blanketed in fallen leaves, their hues of amber and crimson muted under a sky streaked with wispy clouds, while a distant lawnmower buzzed faintly, its drone threading through the crisp air. A pair of squirrels chased each other up an oak, their scampering a fleeting ripple in the stillness, and the world outside stretched into a tentative calm, a quiet balm over wounds still raw. Matthew moved through the nursery, the room now warm with use, its walls adorned with a few framed prints Elizabeth had picked, simple sketches of stars and trees, their lines soft and hopeful. Lucas cooed from the crib, his tiny hands grasping at a rattle, and Matthew adjusted the blanket around him, his touch steady, practiced. He'd settled into this rhythm, bottles at dawn, naps in the afternoon, a fragile routine carved from chaos. On a shelf, he found her sketchbook, its leather cover worn at the edges, and flipped it open, his breath catching at the sight. Pencil drawings of their future family, him, her, a child laughing between them, her strokes vivid with dreams. "You saw this, didn't you?" he murmured, tracing a line with his fingertip, the paper cool against his skin. The resolve to move forward flared, a quiet fire fueled by her vision, steadying him against the ache. Downstairs, Barbara stood in the foyer, her coat buttoned tight, a small duffel slung over her shoulder. Her guilt lingered in the lines of her face, softened now, but present, etched into the way her hands fidgeted with the strap. "I'm ready," she said, her voice low, steady, but tinged with something fragile. Matthew pulled an envelope from his pocket, thick with cash, and pressed it into her palm, his grip firm. "There's a town, Harrington 3 hours north," he told her, his tone even, practical. "Quiet, off the map. Start over there. Don't come back." She nodded, her eyes glistening as they met his, and whispered, "I'm sorry for everything." He held her gaze a moment, then stepped back. "Just go," he said, softer now, the words a release more than a command. She turned, stepping into the waiting taxi, its engine humming as it carried her away, her silhouette shrinking against the horizon. In the days that followed, Matthew sat at his desk, papers spread wide. Contracts, financials, the sprawling web of his company now under scrutiny. He trimmed its scope with a steady hand, shedding the bloated ambitions Alex had chased, signing off on sales that cut away the greed that had festered. "This is ours now, Lucas," he said one afternoon, glancing at the baby and a bouncer nearby, his voice quiet but firm. "Just what we need, no more." Nights passed in the nursery, Matthew humming tunes Elizabeth loved, old folk songs, her voice echoing in his memory as he sang, the melodies threading through the quiet, wrapping around them both like a promise kept. A memory glowed, unbidden. Elizabeth sitting across from him at their kitchen table, her hand tracing his palm as she smiled, her voice soft with certainty. "We'll face anything together, you, me, and whoever comes next," she'd said, her fingers warm against his, her eyes bright with a future they'd planned. He smiled faintly now, the pain dulling to a tender ache, a scar instead of a wound, and leaned back in the chair, letting the warmth of it settle into his bones. "We're still here," he whispered, the words a quiet bridge to her, his hand resting lightly on Lucas's crib, grounding him in the present. Evening crept in, the sky a deepening blue beyond the windows, and Matthew packed a bag, diapers, a blanket, a thermos of coffee, his movements deliberate, unhurried. He slung it over his shoulder, lifting Lucas into his arms, the baby's weight a steady anchor as he locked the door behind them. "Let's go see her lake," he said, his voice soft, a faint smile tugging at his lips as he secured Lucas in the car seat, the engine rumbling awake beneath him. Elizabeth's favorite spot, a quiet stretch of water framed by pines, beckoned, a step toward healing carved from memory, and he drove into the dusk, the road unfurling before him, a fragile peace settling in the space where rage had once burned. Spring unfurled over the land in a tender embrace, the air thick with the scent of blooming wildflowers and the faint hum of bees weaving through the grasses. Beyond the cemetery's iron gates, The hills rolled green and vibrant, their slopes dotted with bursts of yellow and lavender, while a soft breeze rustled the leaves of ancient oaks, their branches swaying in a quiet dance with the morning sun. The world stretched wide and alive, a canvas of renewal painted in hues of warmth and light, its beauty a gentle hand brushing against scars still healing. Matthew stepped from the car, the gravel crunching under his boots. Lucas balanced on his hip, a white lily clasped in his free hand. Months had passed, weaving a tapestry of quiet days and small victories, and he moved through the cemetery with a steady stride, the headstones no longer looming but standing as silent keepers of memory. He knelt by Elizabeth's grave, sunlight glinting off the polished stone, her name etched in elegant curves that caught the light. "Hey, love," he said, his voice soft, steady, as he set the lily atop the marble, its petals stark against the grey. "He's walking now, took his first steps last week, right into the coffee table." A faint chuckle escaped him, and he shifted Lucas, the boy tugging at his sleeve, babbling a string of joyous nonsense. "He's got your laugh, those little giggles, all you." Lucas squirmed, reaching for the grass, and Matthew set him down, watching as he toddled a few steps, his small hands grasping at the blades. "He's growing fast," Matthew continued, his gaze drifting back to the stone, the words a bridge across time. "You'd be so proud. He's tough, like you were." His throat tightened, but the ache was softer now, a tender echo rather than a wound, and he brushed a hand over the stone, feeling its warmth under the sun's touch, a quiet connection that held him steady. The drive to the lake passed in companionable silence, Lucas dozing in the car seat, the road winding through fields and forests until the water came into view, shimmering under a sky of endless blue framed by pines that stood tall and resolute. Matthew parked near the shore, lifting Lucas as he stepped onto the sandy bank, the air alive with the scent of damp earth and the faint tang of pine resin. He knelt, dipping Lucas's bare feet into the cool shallows, and chuckled as the boy squealed, his tiny toes curling against the water's kiss. "Like that, huh?" he said, his voice light, a grin tugging at his lips as he splashed gently, Lucas's laughter ringing out, a sound pure and bright, a melody that echoed Elizabeth's joy. He settled onto the sand, Lucas perched beside him, and scooped handfuls of damp earth, patting them into a small sandcastle, a lopsided tower with a moat, a nod to the dreams Elizabeth had spun of summers here. "She'd have built you a whole kingdom," he told Lucas, smoothing a wall with his thumb, the boy's chubby hands patting the top, babbling happily. The horizon stretched wide before them, a boundless sweep of water and sky. And Matthew leaned back, the sun warming his face as a breeze carried the lake's whispers. He felt her then, not in the grip of grief, but in a quiet, steady love. Her presence woven into the light, the laughter, the life beside him. "I'll raise him right," he said, his voice a vow, low and firm as he looked at Lucas. The boy's eyes, green like hers, sparkling with wonder. "He'll have your strength, your warmth, everything you were." The words settled into the air, a promise sealed in the stillness, and Matthew brushed sand from his hands, the weight of loss lifting, replaced by a hope that bloomed soft and sure. Lucas tugged at his shirt, and he scooped him up, rising to his feet with a steady stride. The sunset cast gold across the water as they walked to the car, its surface a mirror of fire and light, the pines standing sentinel against the fading day. Matthew secured Lucas in the seat, the boy's head lolling with sleep, and paused, resting a hand on the doorframe, his gaze lingering on the lake. "We're okay," he whispered, the words a quiet tether to her, his stride firm as he climbed in, the engine humming to life. The road stretched ahead, bathed in the glow of dusk, and he drove on, a quiet promise in each step, carrying them toward a future lit by love. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. And if you enjoyed this story, please share it with your friends on WhatsApp. And now, share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values yet entertaining. See you there.